Behöver du hitta ny energi? Vi på Fortum gör det enkelt att välja rätt elavtal. Med Fortum får du trygghet, en smart app och personlig service. Så byt till Fortum, Nordens mest valda elbolag. Upptäck kraften i nordisk energi.
När ett barn blir allvarligt sjukt behöver du hantera en ny vardag. Men det finns stöd att få. Ronald McDonald Hus ger familjer möjligheten att bo tillsammans medan barnet vårdas på sjukhus. Vill du ge fler familjer samma möjlighet? Swisha till 970 22.
Under miljontals år har djur utvecklat sofistikerade parningsritualer. Fåglar dansar, vargar ylar och Oscar går in på Amazon för att förbereda sin date night lasagne till King. På Amazon hittar han levande ljus, lyxiga vinglas till fyndpris och en extra tandborste utifall att. Date night får det att hända. Hitta det på amazon.se.
Frank Furedi är en av de mer inspirerande tänkarna jag stött på. Hans formella titel är professor emeritus i sociologi vid universitetet i Kent i Storbritannien där han också bor. Men han har också varit en otroligt produktiv offentlig intellektuell under lång tid. Jag har säkert räknat fel eller missat någon bok, men vad jag kan se har han skrivit 25 böcker sedan 1986. Hans senaste bok heter Democracy Under Siege som kom ut i oktober förra året. Och i den visar han hur motståndet mot demokrati har en lång historia. Men förr brukade filosofer och andra vara öppet föraktfulla mot folket eller pöbeln och vara helt ärliga med att demokrati var något som de såg som farligt. Idag har det blivit ofint och därför kommer föraktet till uttryck på andra sätt genom omskrivningar. Man attackerar inte demokratin rakt på utan varnar istället för populism till exempel. Etablissemang runt om i världen har drabbats av vad Furedi i boken kallar för demokratipanik, vilket får dem att försöka begränsa medborgarnas inflytande på olika sätt. Man avpolitiserar frågor, för över deras avgörande till experter, låter teknokrater sköta mer och mer. Och den som protesterar mot det kallas farlig, extrem eller populist. Det som pågår är en dragkamp mellan torget och tornet, mellan folket och etablissemanget, mellan en förskansad elit som vill behålla makten och folket som vill att demokrati ska vara mer än en procedur för att välja samma gamla klägg om och om igen, för att använda Håkan Juholts uttryck. Ungefär så kanske man kan i alla fall introducera boken som vi pratar om idag. Nu till dagens gäst. Du lyssnar på Rak höger med mig, Ivar Arpi. Welcome, Frank Furedi, to Rak höger.
Pleasure to talk to you.
I actually came across your work for the first time when I read Therapy Culture, a book that came out in 2003, I believe. But I read it a couple of years later, and it sort of blew my mind because it was especially one example in your book where you go through how many times that we mention terms like stress and anxiety and how we continuously changing our way to describe hardship in a therapeutic language. And I realized I'd been doing that for my whole life. So I had to like really rethink how I described myself. And I think you brought up like a mining crisis in Wales, I think, and that when it happened, people don't seem that traumatized. But then the media went back with their therapeutic language, and they sort of reinvented the trauma of the miners because a lot of children died. Of course, it was an awful catastrophe. But could you just summarize the thesis of therapy culture? Just for me. No, but it's a very interesting thesis, and I think it's really present today still.
I think what I was trying to deal with was the fact that what is to be a human being, what a person is, has been gradually reshaped by the discipline of psychology. And, psychology is okay in a clinical setting, but when it becomes something that is used to define who we are, how we think, then the way we experience the world alters fundamentally. So, for example, I always remember when my son came home from school at the age of 7, and he was using words like "I'm stressed," "I'm depressed." He sounded like a little Freud. And I'm sure he didn't know what those words really meant. But the very fact that the teachers were talking about being traumatized and being stressed in such a casual kind of way meant that young children were already encouraged to become extremely inward looking. And instead of engaging with the external world and having a sense of their strength, they were always being reminded of their weaknesses, their powerlessness. And that's why the subtitle of the book is Therapy Culture, Cultivating Vulnerability, because what we're doing is we're almost encouraging people to become conscious of how weak and powerless we really are, and therefore how important it is that you and I are insulated from the pains of everyday life, from distress, from the normal forms of rejection, which are inevitable, from the pressures that are kind of placed upon us. And so the book is really an exploration of the meanings of this cultural turn for everyday human behavior in the Western setting.
And I mean, you wrote this book you saw a trend that has just accelerated, I would say. So you were really ahead of the curve there, because I mean, it was 12 years later that Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff came out with their book, where they see that the vulnerability of American students is exploding on college campuses. And Greg Lukianoff, who said that he had fought The Coddling of the American Mind is the book, and the article that was the basis of the book. And the coddling is just that you're encouraging to see yourself as vulnerable and behave as if you are vulnerable. And so Greg Lukianoff had fought with clinical depression, and he had what had helped him was cognitive behavioral therapy, where you try to become less vulnerable. And he saw that our culture is doing the exact opposite. But you saw these trends 10 or 15 years earlier. So it's really interesting, because now I think it was when I read your book that I realized that the words, maybe I'm a late bloomer or not so smart, but it was the first time, I think, that I realized that the word stress is not a neutral way to describe something. It's actually a cultural word to describe a phenomenon, or it's not a natural state. So, but do you think that the trend that you saw then has accelerated as I describe it, or do you agree with that, or how do you view it now?
Well, the way that I see it is that language is very useful, because almost all the words that we use in the English language, I don't know about Swedish or other languages, have fundamentally altered. We're using words now routinely that would have been unthinkable in the past. For example, the word vulnerable was never used as a psychological word until the 1980s. Until that point, it was used as a description of physical entities. They talked about the vulnerability of bridges or of buildings. The first time it was used in relation to babies in 1978, 79 by some psychiatrists. And then it just exploded. Now that was, sort of in the 80s. But when I wrote my book, sort of at the turn of the 21st century, that was, was already in the mainstream. But today, in 2021, the psychological turn has acquired such a powerful momentum that it is literally become the defining medium through which Western society interprets its cultural experience, its political experience, so that the boundary between what is our inner life and what is our outer life has gone completely. The two are entirely the same, and in that sense, we become so accustomed to it that we don't even notice that there's anything unusual about defining normal problems of life, such as distress, or pain, which is a normal part of our life, through a psychological diagnosis.
And also, there's been a trend to take our terms, the psychological terms, the therapeutic language, and project them onto history. So, for example, you can say that how many of the Roman legionaries had PTSD, and you can go back and you give psychological diagnoses or psychiatric diagnoses to historical figures to explain their ideas or their behaviors. So we are replacing an older language with this, an older frame of analysis with this therapeutic frame of analysis.
Yeah, I mean, it's got a totally imperialistic ambition, so it wants to spread everywhere. And we have a situation where the past is continually being rewritten as if the people in the 14th or 12th century had already become familiar with Freud or with Jung or all these people. And I think the best example for me, the way that this works, is if you look at the decolonization movement in Britain, you have a situation where a lot of students at Oxford University complain about the fact that when they see a statue of Rhodes, they get traumatized by it. Just the very fact that you see an old statue totally traumatizes you. And I think that's something that tells us that, in a sense, through the use of psychology, the boundary between the present and the past has been also continually eroded. It's almost as if we kind of read history backwards through the language of psychology.
Yeah, and now I'll move from because I think this is still one of the best books on this subject, even though it's past. It really predated the social media and all that, and the college campus and identity politics woke, the Great Awakening and all that. But I still think that the therapy culture, I really recommend that book because it's really, really good. And you've written a new book, which has the title Democracy Under Siege. And this was the reason that I invited you onto the podcast today, because in this book, you explain how the idea of democracy has been challenged historically, but since the 1900s, the 1800s, 19th century, you don't challenge it formally anymore, really. You don't say that I'm against democracy. You say that you are against populism, or that you are for liberal constraints on democracy and stuff like that. But so could you explain in what way do you agree with that summary, and could you elaborate on in which way democracy is under siege today?
Well, I wrote the book because I noticed that if you go into a bookshop, this is before COVID, you go into a big bookshop in New York or in London, and you look at the non-fiction section, there are loads and loads of books that are written with the title Against Democracy, with titles that suggest that there's something wrong with democracy. So they're quite explicit in raising suspicion about it. And I noticed that even people who pay lip service to democracy continually put limitations on it. And this became very evident to me when I was doing a speaking tour in Europe on the subject of populism. And I kind of shocked the audience because they couldn't imagine that a sociology professor would actually have something positive to say about populism. And they couldn't imagine, why I was doing this. And this guy puts up his hand, this is in Amsterdam, and says to me, Professor Furedi, are you saying that democracy is something that is good in and of itself? And I said, yes. I said, this is a value that, even if the people that I want to get elected get defeated, I still would rather have a democratic process. I would rather have a democratic society, even if I lose, than somehow manipulate things in such a way that the guy that I like becomes prime minister. And I said, to me, democracy is something that's about living a particular kind of a life. It's democracy is something you live rather than something that's given to you on a piece of paper. And the audience just erupted. They couldn't believe how anybody could say that democracy is more than just a method for getting people elected. That was a valuable thing in and of itself. And I looked around and I realized that everywhere I went, people were using the expression, I believe in democracy, but. But it's what came after the but that was important, right? And what came after the but was actually, I don't believe in democracy. I don't think that we can trust the people. I think that experts should have more of a say in how we deal with this and that problem. Or alternatively, they would say that there are educated people who are more sensitive and understand what needs to be done than these millions of ignorant individuals. And when you actually scratch the surface, you'll find that the arguments they were using against democracy more or less rehashed those arguments that were already used in ancient Athens by the oligarchy against the demos. So I just thought this was very important, particularly at the time of COVID, when there was such a contempt for the democratic process, and when all of a sudden everybody was saying that now is not the time for political debate, political discussion. Now is the time for the experts to tell us what needs to be done.
So I think the example of COVID is very interesting. We have had, you live in Great Britain and I live in Sweden. So we have had different experiences because the countries have dealt very differently with COVID. But one thing that I noticed in Sweden is the experts at Folkhälsomyndigheten, they were the ones in charge. So the experts were totally in charge. And what we had some public debate, but there was really, in the beginning, you were labeled almost a traitor if you challenged the expert government agency. And so you had to be subservient, loyal, and quiet. That was your role as a citizen. And those who did not conform to that was very heavily criticized. And it didn't just pertain to citizens in the public sphere, but also scientists. So you had differing views from scientists with a lot of, they were not crackpots. These were some of our most cited scientists in the field. So they were really experts in the particular, in epidemiology and associated sciences. So, but there were no way for them to be heard from the government agency, and they were frowned upon and they were ridiculed. So what we really had was we had the show of, still they weren't put in jail or anything, but the social stigma for them was very high. And a lot of people who were caught on the wrong side of the argument had a new view of how our democracy really works. So we should obey and we should not question authority. And this, I think, highlights some of the themes in your book as well, that where they say that some people say, many people say, and many authority figures say that they like a democracy, but what they really like is the legitimacy that comes with being elected. But they don't like when the citizens raise their voice other times.
No, I think that's true. I think it was more or less the same situation in Britain as in Sweden, which is a very strange thing, because I do believe in expertise. For example, if I have a problem with my heart, I go to the best surgeon that I can possibly find. And, if I want to know something about how the planets work, I go and talk to a scientist and I check out the experts. But there's a difference between the exercise of legitimate expertise in relation to their particular domain and the experts having the role of being political authorities, where they assume the political role of telling us how to live our lives, and moreover tell us that there is only one way of going forward, that whatever they say about how we live our lives is beyond discussion and beyond debate. And I think that's really where their anti-democratic ethos, really comes out, because I'm happy to listen to what they're saying, but at the end of the day, I'm not a child. You're not a child. We are in a position to discuss, argue, debate, find some ways of making up our mind. We listen to different experts because they don't always agree anyway on many of these things. And in particular, when you have a pandemic, one thing we learned from the history of disasters is that very often it's through the context, the specific context within which people live, where they can exercise their common sense, where the communities can work out what is the best way forward, that is usually the most effective way of limiting the damage that a particular pandemic or a disaster causes. So I think in that sense, there was a very real anti-democratic turn that occurred. And in Britain, for example, they used the word COVID deniers. And a COVID denier wasn't somebody that necessarily said that COVID didn't exist. I mean, I think COVID exists. I think COVID is a big problem. I certainly don't want to get it. But the reason why they used the word COVID deniers was because, as a metaphor, it signaled that it meant the same thing as a Holocaust denier. It was just as bad as denying that the Holocaust existed. So it was a kind of a rhetorical trick as a way of stigmatizing and isolating people who raise doubts about these kinds of questions. And as a result of that, what has happened is that a wrong debate was created, and worse still, a lot of people that were stigmatized, that were pushed out from public conversation, then went to the other extreme. And you had a situation where people who felt that they weren't being listened to began to listen a lot of these crazy theories, conspiracy theories, that kind of QAnon-like kind of ideals about the fact that COVID didn't exist and all the rest of that. And it created a situation where rather than us coming together and struggling to come up with solutions, we basically created these parallel universes where people felt scared to open their mouth and raise their criticism. And self-censorship is probably a greater threat to democracy than real censorship.
So I remember when I read, if you go back to the question of populism, when I read political science in the early 2000s, one definition was that you give simple answers to complex questions, and I thought that was a great definition. But I don't think that anymore, and because it's a way to. What I found is that is what you describe in the book very very well, is that it's basically a charge that's leveled against people who want more influence over politics, or who want to politicize you, because you also what you show is that issues have been depoliticized or technocratized so to take away from citizens the way to influence certain issues. So when they want to take control or influence those issues again and exert their political influence to do that, they are labeled populists. Is that a fair summary of what you say?
It is more or less. I think what I'm trying to argue is that at the moment, the political establishments in Europe prefer what I call an insulated form of democracy, where they insulate their institutions from public pressure. And public pressure they call populism. And the way they insulate it is by outsourcing political decision-making to technocratic bodies like the EU, the European Union, or to the IMF, or to certain scientific bodies who get to decide a growing sort of proportion of the decisions that are taken that are actually quite political. So, for example, you and I don't have any influence over financial policy anymore. We don't have any influence over the setting of interest rates. We don't have any influence in the way that certain trade policies are decided. that affect farmers and employers and all the rest of that. All those things are taken out of our hands. And more recently, that has gone into other domains of life, because by medicalizing our life, by turning ordinary social problems into medical ones, sort of we become even more deprived of debating and discussing and influencing our events. And for me, what populism represents in the 21st century is a demand for voice, a demand to be heard, a demand to be part of the conversation. And that's why they're stigmatized. That's why populism is seen as a form of far-right fascism. It's always denounced in a language that's very, very unrestrained, and which is entirely an attempt to pathologize populism, because the last thing you want is a situation where millions and millions of people feel that they're confident enough to raise questions and demand to be part of the discussion.
And this actually brings us back to the therapeutic language, that because you also bring up in your book how you psychologize the people you call populists, or the supporters of populism, so that you give them psychological traits to describe them as sick or dysfunctional in some ways. So you don't have to deal with them as equals, but rather as people who you have to treat in some way, almost. So it's a very and also when perhaps it's fitting that Donald Trump received this treatment, because he is a very special person. But the psychologists in the United States, they broke a code of honor that you should not psychologize the president or the presidential candidates. But they made an exception for Donald Trump. So they crossed over into not treating him as a political figure, but rather as a rambling lunatic. And also that translated in how you view the voters for such a character, and how you view the voters for these right-wing populists, but also like a segment of the population that you don't treat as political actors, but rather as some deplorables. So for you, if you want to use Hillary Clinton's term.
Yeah, I mean, this became very clear in Britain at the time of Brexit, where people that wanted to leave the European Union were described in very unflattering psychological terms as people that were authoritarian. I mean, that's the main word that's used, that they're authoritarian, they're insecure. I mean, a lot of psychological labels were used to suggest that the people that were supporting Brexit were not only sort of psychologically sort of ill, but also because of that, they were morally inferior. Because you have to remember that one of the important things about psychology is that it serves as a medium through which moral judgments are often conveyed. So when you make a diagnosis of somebody as being, let's say, having an authoritarian personality, that's not just simply a psychological label, it's also a sign of moral inferiority. And when you explore the way in which populism itself has been described and very actively discussed by different teams of psychologists, they always use a language that suggests that these people are not as intelligent as people on the other side. I mean, that comes up all the time. There's all these studies that suggest that somehow these individuals are emotionally illiterate, whilst people who are against populism are more sophisticated emotionally. They claim that they are more able to deal with complex ideas than these simpletons who kind of inhabit the populist camp. And after a while, what psychology does, and in the way that it's used as a political weapon, is it...
Trippelt välkommen tillbaka säger vi till cheeseburgarnas cheeseburgare. Ja, vi pratar såklart om triple cheese på McDonald's. Lika god som vår cheeseburgare, fast trippelt. Bara på McDonald's.
Upptäck Ford e-Custom, elversionen av Europas mest sålda transportbil. Den har upp till 370 kilometers räckvidd, snabbladdning och finns nu med fyrhjulsdrift. Just nu till Ford Pro Edition-pris från 479 000 ex-moms. Läs mer på Ford.se eller besök din Ford-återförsäljare. Ready, set, Ford.
Tänk om din plånbok kunde prata. Vad skulle den då säga om din relation till ekonomi?
Alla relationer har ju sina ups and downs. Men att han har lån lite här och där, det tror jag skulle vara en ick för rätt många plånböcker och inte bara för mig.
Ett första steg mot en bättre relation till sin plånbok kan vara att samla sina lån.
Samla dina lån till ett på lendo.se.
It spares people from the burden of having to argue politically. Because what's the point of arguing politically with simple people who are psychologically ill, who suffer from horrible authoritarian related diseases? You don't argue with them, you treat them. And in many ways, that as a Hungarian, somebody born in Hungary in the Stalinist period, that very much reminds me of the way that in Stalinist period in Soviet Union, they would be treating dissidents. They would kind of send them to centers where psychiatrists would deal with them in ways that was very, very similar, maybe a little bit more harsh, because you don't get sort of sent to asylums the way they did in the Soviet Union, but the impulse of using psychology to destroy you, your kind of political reputation, was very much the same.
There's a liberal, I'm not going to name him, but he's one of the most prominent liberal journalists, thinkers here in Sweden. He during a talk he had, or debate, he said that the reason that populists hate us liberals is because we were better than them in school. And you know what? We're still better than you are in school. So he's basically saying that it's a question of IQ. I'm not doubting that he's a smart guy, but I do think that he underestimates his opponents, and it's very condescending. But you also bring up this that people are that rationality and reason is viewed sort of like a preserve for a certain class of people. And you trace this back through history, that you have this philosopher class who are able to reason, who are able to tackle complex issues, and who are able to be rational, where sort of the masses or the public or the people, they aren't able, and they are sort of dangerous, so you should not give them too much responsibility, because that can go awry.
Yeah, I mean, ever since the Greeks, when they used to argue that demagogues could easily sway the masses, they were too stupid to think for themselves, to the point at which when mass reading began, and they used to argue that we shouldn't give books to ordinary people because they would misinterpret it and draw the conclusion, all the way to then arguing that advertisers, on television, are so strong and the people are so easily manipulated that these poor fools go out and buy everything that they're told, to the point at which now they argue that the social media can literally, kind of encourage people to do the opposite of what is in their interest. There's always the assumption that there are these forces above us, which are like mainly the media, which can manipulate the people who haven't got the capacity to think for themselves. And it's very interesting that there's very few important philosophers in the Western tradition that challenge this. In fact, one of the first philosophers, political thinkers that questioned this kind of representation was actually Niccolo Machiavelli, when basically he wrote about what he called the wisdom of the masses. And he made the point that although the prince can be very smart and very intelligent, like your friend, the liberal thinker in Sweden, at the end of the day, the wisdom of the masses far outweigh the wisdom of that individual, because the collective experience of people who actually see what everyday life is like provides really valuable insights about the way that the world works. And as it happens, we know from history that the really smart people are not necessarily the ones that are on top, the old establishment. They are, in fact, people who try to struggle to better themselves and to make their own way from below. And that's why you'll find that in most European countries, the ruling establishment gets refreshed time and time again by the smart people from below. And that's really how it works. And very often it's the experience of being part of the people and forcing yourself to kind of understand that, but to make your way out of that to become something else. That to me is the most important vehicle, the medium for really gaining that wisdom and intelligence that often is in rare supply. So it's not the smart liberal or smart experts, but it's actually a more complex dynamic that we're talking about.
And in a book by Martin Gurri, I think I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly, but he wrote a book which is called Revolt of the Public. He says that it has a similar theme to your book. And one of the things that he says is that because of social media and internet, now the establishment in a lot of countries, they are losing their power to control the information. So you have, for example, in COVID, if it were 30 years ago, perhaps, then you've had when the experts said that this is the way to do it, people would have had a hard time to get other information. But now you see how other countries are dealing with it, and you also see that there is a lot of disagreement within the expert community all over the world, and you can immediately access that. So you have the Swedish experts and the government agency. They are more easily challenged by facts from other experts or facts or viewpoints. And also you can contrast how Sweden is dealing with it or Great Britain with how Australia, New Zealand or United States. The establishment feels much more under threat today. And one of the ways that it's dealing with it is to insulate themselves more. They feel more threatened. And one incident that's famous in Great Britain is when Gordon Brown was during, I'm not sure which election it was, but he was around talking to regular people, and an old lady voiced her concern about immigration. And then he got into his car and he forgot to switch his mic off. And he said, who put me in front of that bigoted woman? And I think Gordon Brown expressed something that's expressed in secret or when nobody hears a lot. So you have to control the contact with the public, and because you're afraid of the challenges from the public. So rather, if you go back 100 years, you had mass movements and the politicians perhaps were the figureheads of mass movements to a larger degree. And now they are more afraid of the public. They're afraid of the voters. And also you can see this I worked at Svenska Dagbladet for a long time. I still write columns there one time a month. But one thing you notice on Twitter with journalists is that they sort of brag about the hate they receive from readers or the stupid readers, and they make like screenshots of the stupidity of ordinary readers. So it's something you can see in the establishment. And also I came out, I'll end soon, but I came out with a book called Genusdoktriner, or the Gender Doctrine, together with Anna-Karin, and because it was not vetted through a peer review process, they had like internal seminars, academics and gender studies professors about our book, but they didn't invite us because we were outsiders. So you have this outsider-insider dynamic that Martin Gurri brings up in his book, that there's it's heightened the conflict between the establishment and the public.
Yeah, in my new book that's coming out next month, I talk about this because I'm trying to understand, what is it that binds together the kind of people you're describing? Because unlike in previous times, it's not a public ideology. sort of, it's not like liberalism, it's not conservatism, it's not socialism, really. I mean, those things barely exist. So I call it in my book an ideology without a name. And what it is that it's really a l'esprit de corps, where they know exactly, what the problems are. They more or less react the same kind of a way. So when you have a dinner party in the Silicon Valley, the guy from Netflix and the guy from Apple and the politician from Washington can be more or less relied to respond to a question, a political problem, in the same kind of a way. And I think that this sensibility, which is one of we're different than they are, that kind of sense of distinction is best expressed in certainly in the English language by the term awareness, in the sense of, we are here to raise your awareness. And when they say raise your awareness, what they really mean is that we want you to think the way we think, because we know better than you do what is in your interest or what's in everybody else's interest. And therefore, what they have is a situation where their public face is always, I'm going to raise your awareness, but their private face is really talking in a very contemptuous way about ordinary people. And it's in their minds, these people are scum. They're white trash. They're people who are, by definition, sort of racist. They're homophobic, they're Islamophobic, they're all kinds of phobia. They're not really worth talking to or taken seriously. And therefore, their strategy at the moment, in order to strengthen their position, is to bypass the people and to go into the schools where you have very, very young children, 5, 6, 7, 8-year-olds, and directly try to socialize them, to kind of almost kind of indoctrinate them. This is something that you can already see signs of in Sweden a long time ago in the interwar period, when the social democratic government, the Myrdals and all these other people, began to introduce this kind of education in the nurseries and in primary education. But that was nothing compared to what you're getting now. And I think that's the way that they're trying to create a base of support in order to overcome the isolation that they experience.
And I mean, this is my oldest daughter just started her mandatory. They lower the age for mandatory schooling in Sweden, so they lowered it just to 6 years old. And then perhaps it's no surprise then that the Liberal Party and the left-wing parties, they are the ones who want to lower it even further. So some are discussing, should we lower it to 2 years old or 3 years old from mandatory schooling, because you have to start early if you're going to be able to influence their minds, and you have to separate the child from the family.
Exactly, yeah.
So that the old way of thinking, that the parents who are not educated enough in the ways of thinking, or they belong to an older mindset, so they can just, you have to, they should not influence their children too much, because then they'll get, they won't have this new mindset that we need them to have.
Exactly. I mean, this is what this is my issue at the moment, because in many respects, the big political battle in our societies is over how we socialize children. It's not just bringing kids up, it's about what kind of world we want to live in. And I know myself, so I'm much older than you are, but already 10, 15 years ago, when my son was in school, we used to have this, we used to laugh about it, because my wife and I, what we would do is debrief him from what he was learning. And we used to say, this is what the Furedis think, this is what they think in school. So about every issue, we would give a different point of view, because that was the way we felt. We could make sure that he remained on our side rather than on the stuff that they were getting from their teachers, and yet to almost subvert the educational process, because he was getting so much, sort of really horrible stuff that he was being taught. And that was 15 years ago. Now it's far worse. I mean, now you have systematic programs of indoctrination in British schools, where, for example, just yesterday, the Scottish government introduced a program of making white children feel guilty about being white. So they're learning about white fragility. They're learning about the importance of understanding that they have a privilege that dominates their whole life. And if a 5-6-year-old child happens to say, I don't agree, they will shoot that child down. And I've got lots of examples of parents who say their 7-year-old girl started crying when she was being made feel guilty for being white. The teacher just treats her like a mature adult and starts getting involved in an argument. So that's the kind of world that we move in. And what begins in the nurseries and in the schools can be directly connected to the way that different types of establishments, political, cultural, are attempting to stabilize their own rule and create a degree of legitimacy for themselves.
And this is sort of this will play out in all societies, I think. What you have in United States, for example, you have Christopher Rufo, who is organizing the resistance towards critical race theory and the theories that you bring up, and this raising children to be aware of race. And if you're white, then you should be aware of your privilege and the position of power and made to feel guilty. And if you're black, then you should be afraid because at any time the cops can come and kill you, so to speak. So, and that's an actual example where a black child who came home to his parents and he was afraid. No, he was biracial, that child, but viewed as black. So he came home and he was scared of his grandparents on his mother's side, who was white, because he thought that they were racists, and so he was very conflicted, and that's like a 7-year-old. But what Christopher Rufo has done is they have introduced laws in some states in the United States. He helped with the legislation to fight this, and parents all over the United States are organizing to try to get this those theories away from their schools. But I mean, it's an ongoing struggle. It's not something that it's not evident that which side will win. But I think that the dynamic is that people, it's sort of when the printing press came around, and that sort of enabled the Protestant awakening, that you could translate the Bible and you could produce the Bible in local languages, and you could put the Bible in the hand of ordinary people. So you did not have to have the priest tell you what was in the Bible. You could actually read the Bible for yourself and have reading circles and make up your own mind. And that was fought by the Catholic Church. This is a very simplified version of this, but now we're having something similar where people are having, they don't have to rely on 1 or 2 state channels on TV, 1 or 2 or 3 big newspapers, and so they don't trust authority blindly anymore, and they can make up their own minds. And then you have the establishment reacting by labeling what they find as abhorrent or morally dubious. They label that as populist, and they fight that, and they have to fight that to stay in power. I sound like a conspiracy theorist, but I mean, on if you have on a grand level, I think there's a ongoing struggle between the populist uprisings on the left and on the right, and against the establishment.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth in what you say. I mean, the unfortunate thing is that when you had the Protestant awakening, and in places like Denmark and Sweden, through the Lutheran Church, they introduced, they actually encouraged people to learn how to read, and they gave people the Bible, and they trusted them to read the Bible. I think then you had a really powerful movement that was for the good in terms of its impact upon cultural and moral and political life. At the moment, unfortunately, what we have is a similar, in many ways, a similar kind of war being fought out, but the resources and the powers on the wrong side. And people like myself and others are continually forced to react rather than to initiate. And that's almost the very opposite to what happened with the Protestant awakening, where they were the ones that had the momentum. So at the moment, the kind of what I call the culture war is being fought out on a terrain not of our own making. And we don't have yet a kind of sufficiently serious, mature movement to be able to sort of hold the fort, where we have our groups of individuals here and there reacting. And unfortunately, history shows that when you react, it's never as powerful as when you initiate. So for me, the key thing then becomes is how can we initiate, movements? I think that's why Brexit was so important, because with Brexit you had finally an example of people themselves initiating a movement that was seen as a joke, that was treated with contempt, but yet has sufficient momentum to be able to withstand all the powerful pressures from everywhere to kind of continue on and actually win. And to me, the Brexit moment was really quite important, because even today, it's left a legacy. And there are a lot of, Britain is no longer what it was, because there are a lot of people around who before would have never imagined that they had a role to play in public life, who now take a different view. So what we need, in a sense, it doesn't have to be Brexit or leaving the European Union. What it's got to be is a movement where people have got the confidence to be able to take matters into their own hands and to follow their intuition and their instinct. And I think that to me seems to be the challenge of our times.
We had a moment where, for the first time in our political history in Sweden, the prime minister had a vote on no confidence and was forced out of office. And then he came back. But what happened was that the left-wing party, the former Communist Party, they actually made good of a threat that they had made. Like if you try to introduce market rates in the rent market, or renting in the housing market, then we will give a no confidence vote. And when they've made similar threats historically, the Social Democrats have always been able to think that, okay, but they must choose is it better with the Social Democrats in power or with the right-wing government in power? And the left-wing party has always been sort of subservient to the Social Democrats. But now there's a new generation who've taken over the left-wing party, and they actually united with the right-wing opposition and ousted the prime minister. And then he had to make some deals with the left-wing party to be able to come back. So the establishment is still there, but it was sort of a moment where a lot of people, even on the right wing, felt reinvigorated, which is sort of strange, because this, of course, a lot of people on the right have less in common with the left-wing party and their leadership than they do with the Social Democrats in a lot of ways. But what they did was, in my view, they reintroduced, they politicized an issue that the Social Democrats and their liberal collaborators said that this is not a political issue. This is just an expert issue for the market. And then they said that, no, we won't accept that. If you do that, that's a red line. And they made good on the threat. And I found that was this is sort of a lot of issues. We talked about this earlier, but a lot of issues are sort of framed nowadays as these sort of forces of nature. This is not something that we can do anything about. This is just something that we have to accept. And then the left-wing party said that, no, we won't accept it. And of course, they were labeled populist by a lot of people. And maybe they were, but then I would say that that's something good.
Yeah. No, I mean, this is what you really are saying, that is that at the moment, the conventional distinctions between left and right are not as obvious as they were in the past, sort of because we live in a very fluid situation where the inner coherence of both sides of the spectrum, ideological spectrum, have somehow become more diffuse. And therefore, at the end of the day, the question becomes, where you stand in this kind of conflict that we have between society, the public, and the different kind of institutions that have been created since the post-war period that are often, sort of can only exist if democracy is constrained and is limited. So I think to that extent, what happened in Sweden that moment is not unlike what happened with the Yellow Vest movement in France and elsewhere, where often you find yourself with very strange allies, people that you never imagined you'd have anything in common with. Because at the end of the day, when push comes to shove, you have to make a decision. Sort of what's more important, democracy, or sort of being very pragmatic and realistic and just carrying on the same old way.
So I'm going to let you go soon, but you mentioned that you're coming out with a new book. What's the title of that book, and what's the main thesis of the book?
Well, the book is called 100 Years of Identity Crisis, the Cultural War Over Socialization. And what the book is all about is an attempt by me to explain the origins of the culture wars that we experience, which began about 100 years ago, and to trace how it evolved to the present day. And what I argue in the book is that, contrary to what people think, the big conflicts about race, gender, about nation, about sovereignty, about all these issues that we've been discussing, are conflicts that are worked out in the first instance in the area of socialization, because it's through socialization that a society determines what it thinks is good and what it thinks is bad. The values that we live by are the ones that are transmitted to young people. And one of the things that I point out is that over the last 5 generations, it usually takes about 5 generations of people, the values that are dominant today have become normalized. The values that used to be countercultural in the 1960s are now the dominant norms. And it's people like you and me, who, for example, stand up for the Enlightenment values, who stand up for many of the gains of Western civilization. It's people like you and me who are the countercultural, because in many ways, what we're arguing goes against the grain of dominant culture. So the book tries to explain how it began, what it really means, and the issues at stake. So that's coming out next month.
I'm really looking forward to reading that one as well. Thank you so much, Frank Furedi, for being a part of this podcast.
Thanks very much, Ivar.
Och stort tack till dig som har lyssnat. Detta är alltså en del av en större publikation på Substack med samma namn som podden. Den som prenumererar där får 2 texter i veckan utöver den här podden varje söndag. Gillar man det man läser och hör så får man gärna bli betalande prenumerant för 5 euro i månaden eller 50 om året. Och då får man också ta del av lite extra material som är exklusivt för betalande prenumeranter. Du hittar rubbet på ivararpi.se. Och har du några frågor eller synpunkter kan du alltid mejla mig på ivararpi@substack.com. Vi hörs om en vecka.